The Russian Civil War began in 1918, not long after the Russian Revolution had overthrown the centuries-old rule of the Romanov dynasty. It lasted until 1921, though smaller fighting continued for several more years. The war was not a simple struggle between two sides. It was a vast and complicated conflict that spread across the enormous lands of the former Russian Empire, involving multiple armies, foreign powers, political movements, and millions of ordinary people caught in between. To understand why the Civil War began, it is important to look at the events of 1917. In February of that year, widespread protests over food shortages, economic hardship, and the strain of World War I led to the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II. The monarchy collapsed, and a temporary government was formed. This new government promised reforms and elections, but it struggled to maintain control. Russia was still fighting in World War I, and the army was exhausted. The economy was collapsing. Food and fuel were scarce in major cities. Later in October 1917, a second revolution took place. This time, it was led by the Bolsheviks, a radical socialist party under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin. They promised peace, land to peasants, and power to workers. In a carefully organized takeover, they seized control of key government buildings in Petrograd, which is now known as St. Petersburg. The provisional government fell, and the Bolsheviks declared that they would create a new socialist state. However, not everyone accepted Bolshevik rule. Many political groups opposed them. Some believed Russia should become a democratic republic. Others wanted the monarchy restored. Military officers, landowners, and industrial leaders feared the loss of their property and influence. Foreign governments worried about the spread of revolutionary ideas. These tensions soon turned into armed conflict. The Bolshevik forces became known as the Red Army. They were organized under the leadership of Leon Trotsky, who focused on discipline, centralized command, and the use of former imperial officers who were closely supervised. Opposing them were a loose collection of groups known as the White Forces. The Whites were not united by a single ideology. Some wanted to restore the monarchy. Others preferred a military dictatorship. Some supported democracy. Their only common goal was to defeat the Bolsheviks. The war quickly spread across the vast territories of Russia. In the south, white armies formed under generals who had once served the Tsar. In Siberia, another anti-Bolshevik government emerged. In the Baltic regions and Ukraine, nationalist movements sought independence. Each region had its own battles, its own leaders, and its own struggles. The geography of Russia made the war especially difficult. The country stretched across enormous distances, from European cities to frozen Siberian plains. Railways became essential for moving troops and supplies. Control of rail lines often determined which side could advance and which side would be cut off. Winters were harsh, and summers brought mud and disease. Soldiers marched across forests, rivers, and steppe lands, often with limited supplies. Foreign powers also became involved. Britain, France, the United States, and Japan sent troops and supplies to support the White Forces. They feared that a Bolshevik victory would encourage revolutions in their own countries and disrupt global trade. However, foreign intervention was limited and often uncoordinated. While these powers provided assistance, they were unwilling to commit large armies after the devastation of World War I. The fighting was brutal and often chaotic. Cities changed hands multiple times. Villages were looted. Civilians were caught between advancing armies. Food shortages grew worse. Both red and white forces carried out harsh policies against suspected enemies. Arrests, executions, and forced labor became common. This period of violence and repression became known as the Red Terror, though violence occurred on all sides. One of the central struggles of the war was control over the countryside. The Bolsheviks promised land to peasants, but they also demanded grain to feed cities and soldiers. Armed groups were sent to collect food, sometimes by force. This created resentment among rural communities. Peasant uprisings broke out in several regions, adding another layer of conflict to an already complicated war. In 1918, the former Tsar and his family were executed by Bolshevik authorities. This act symbolized the complete end of the old monarchy and made reconciliation between Reds and monarchist whites almost impossible. It hardened positions on both sides and deepened the sense that the struggle was one of survival and ideology. Despite facing opposition on many fronts, the Red Army gradually gained the advantage. The Bolsheviks controlled central regions of Russia, including major cities and industrial areas. They had more unified leadership and clearer goals. Trotsky reorganized the army, imposed strict discipline, and used propaganda to motivate soldiers. Railway networks allowed the Red Army to move forces quickly between different fronts. The White forces, by contrast, were divided. Their leaders often disagreed about the future of Russia. They struggled to coordinate across vast distances. Some alienated peasants by promising to restore land to former landowners. Others depended heavily on foreign support, which made them appear less patriotic to some Russians. By 1920, the main White armies had been defeated. In Siberia, Admiral Kolchak was captured and executed. In the south, General Denikin's forces collapsed. In the northwest, attempts to capture Petrograd failed. The Red Army regained control over most of the former empire. However, the war did not end immediately. Fighting continued in remote regions, and resistance movements persisted. The country was devastated. Industry had nearly collapsed. Transportation networks were damaged. Millions of people had died from fighting, famine, and disease. Entire communities were uprooted. The Russian Civil War was not only a military struggle, it was a social and political transformation. The Bolsheviks aimed to create a new society based on socialist principles. During the war, they implemented policies known as war communism. Private industry was nationalized. Grain was requisitioned from peasants. Strict control was imposed over the economy. These measures were intended to support the war effort, but they also caused hardship and resentment. By 1921, with major resistance crushed, the Bolsheviks consolidated their power. The Russian Civil War had reshaped the country. The old imperial order was gone. In its place emerged a new political system that would soon be known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The war had been long, violent, and exhausting. It left deep scars on the population and established patterns of centralized authority and political control that would shape the Soviet state for decades. It was a conflict not only of armies, but of ideas, fears, and visions for the future of Russia. As the year 1918 turned into 1919, the Russian Civil War grew even more intense and widespread. What had begun as scattered resistance to Bolshevik rule developed into a vast, multi-front struggle stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. The scale of the conflict was enormous. Railways carried soldiers across thousands of kilometers. Armies marched through forests, over frozen rivers, and across open plains. Cities that had once been centers of culture and trade became battlegrounds or supply depots. One of the most important fronts of the war developed in the east, in Siberia. There, Admiral Alexander Kolchak emerged as a leading figure among the White forces. Kolchak declared himself supreme ruler of Russia and attempted to establish a centralized anti-Bolshevik government. His forces initially made significant gains, advancing westward along the Trans-Siberian Railway. For a time, it seemed possible that the White armies from the east might link up with other anti-Bolshevik forces and threaten Moscow itself. However, the situation in Siberia was complex and fragile. The vast distances made coordination difficult. Supplies had to travel thousands of kilometers along a single railway line. Partisan fighters often sabotaged tracks and attacked supply trains. The Red Army, using its control over central Russia, was able to shift troops more quickly between fronts. Trotsky traveled constantly by armored train, directing operations and reinforcing weak points. His ability to move rapidly along rail lines allowed the Red Army to concentrate forces against one enemy at a time. In the south, another major White leader, General Anton Denikin, led forces that advanced northward from the Caucasus region toward Moscow. Denikin's army captured large territories and at one point came within a few hundred kilometers of the capital. For many observers, this appeared to be a decisive moment in the war. If Moscow fell, Bolshevik rule might collapse. Yet Denikin faced serious challenges. His forces struggled with discipline and supply shortages. Many peasants in southern Russia distrusted the whites, fearing that they would restore the old landowners and reverse the redistribution of land. This lack of support weakened the white position. The Red Army launched counteroffensives, pushing Denikin's forces back step by step. By late 1919, his army was retreating toward the Black Sea, eventually evacuating from Crimea. Meanwhile, in the northwest, another white commander, General Nikolai Yudenik, attempted to capture Petrograd. His troops advanced close to the city, and for a brief period, it seemed possible that Petrograd might fall. However, the Red Army mounted a determined defense. Workers and soldiers organized to protect the city, building barricades and reinforcing positions. Yudenik's offensive stalled, and his forces were forced to withdraw. While these large conventional battles were taking place, other conflicts unfolded across the former empire. In Ukraine, multiple factions competed for control, including Bolsheviks, white forces, Ukrainian nationalists, and anarchist groups led by Nestor Makhno. The region became a patchwork of shifting alliances and repeated occupations. Villages were sometimes taken and retaken several times within months. Civilians endured constant uncertainty, unsure which authority would arrive next. In the Baltic region and parts of the Caucasus, nationalist movements declared independence. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan experienced their own struggles during this chaotic period. Some of these regions managed to establish independent states, at least temporarily, as a larger Russian conflict consumed the attention of the main armies. The war was not only fought with rifles and artillery, it was also fought with propaganda and ideology. The Bolsheviks presented themselves as defenders of workers and peasants against reactionary forces. They promised equality and a new social order. Posters, speeches, and newspapers spread these messages widely. The whites, on the other hand, often lacked a unified vision for the future. Some promised a return to the old order. Others spoke of democracy. This lack of a clear and consistent message made it harder for them to win widespread popular support. At the same time, the Bolsheviks implemented strict internal controls. The secret police, known as the Chaika, were tasked with identifying and eliminating opposition. Suspected counter-revolutionaries were arrested, imprisoned, or executed. This period of repression intensified during the Civil War, as leaders believed that harsh measures were necessary to secure victory. Fear and suspicion became common features of daily life in areas under Bolshevik control. Economic conditions continued to deteriorate. Industrial production fell dramatically compared to pre-war levels. Many factories closed due to lack of raw materials or workers. Transportation networks were damaged. In cities, food shortages became severe. Long lines formed outside bakeries. In rural areas, grain requisitioning created resentment and sometimes violent resistance. Famine began to spread in certain regions, compounding the suffering caused by fighting. Despite these hardships, the Red Army maintained its organizational advantages. It had a centralized command structure and control over key industrial centers. Trotsky emphasized discipline, sometimes using harsh punishments to maintain order within the ranks. Desertion was a serious problem on both sides, but the Red Army was generally more successful in rebuilding its forces after setbacks. By the end of 1919 and into 1920, the balance of power shifted decisively in favor of the Reds. Kolchak's regime in Siberia collapsed. He was captured and later executed. Denikin resigned and left Russia. The white movement, once spread across multiple fronts, began to fragment. Some remnants retreated to Crimea under General Pyotr Wrangel, attempting to hold out for one final defense. Even as conventional battles diminished, violence did not disappear. Peasant uprisings flared in several regions, protesting grain seizures and strict policies. One of the most significant revolts occurred in the Tambov region, where peasants organized armed resistance against Bolshevik authorities. The government responded with military force, eventually crushing the uprising. By 1921, the major white armies had been defeated, and the Bolsheviks stood as the dominant power across most of the former Russian Empire. Yet the country they controlled was deeply scarred. Millions had died from combat, disease, and famine. Cities were weakened, and rural communities were exhausted. The economy was near collapse. The Russian Civil War had been more than a battle between competing armies. It had been a struggle over the future direction of an entire society. Different visions of government, property, and national identity had clashed violently across immense distances. As the fighting gradually subsided, the Bolshevik leadership faced the enormous task of rebuilding a shattered nation while shaping it according to their revolutionary ideals. In the quiet that followed the major campaigns, Russia stood transformed. The old imperial world was gone, replaced by a new political order still defining itself amid the ruins of war. By the beginning of 1921, the large organized white armies had mostly been defeated, yet Russia was far from peaceful. The land was exhausted. Years of World War I, followed immediately by revolution and civil war, had pushed the country to the edge of collapse. Railways were damaged, factories stood silent, and farmland had been neglected. Millions of people had died, not only from bullets and artillery, but from hunger, disease, and exposure. The Bolsheviks, now firmly in control of the central government, faced a new and serious problem. Winning the war was one challenge. Governing a devastated country was another. During the Civil War, they had implemented strict policies known as war communism. Private trade was banned. Major industries were nationalized. Grain was forcibly taken from peasants to feed the Red Army and urban workers. These policies were designed to keep the war effort alive, but they had severe consequences. In the countryside, resentment grew. Peasants who had initially supported the revolution because it promised land now felt betrayed. Armed detachments arrived to seize grain, sometimes leaving families with little to survive the winter. Resistance movements appeared in various provinces. The Tambov uprising became one of the largest peasant revolts against Bolshevik authority. For months, local fighters resisted government forces. The Red Army eventually suppressed the rebellion with overwhelming force, but the conflict revealed how fragile stability remained. Even within cities, dissatisfaction spread. Workers who had once supported the Bolsheviks faced food shortages and strict labor discipline. Industrial production had fallen dramatically compared to pre-war levels. Coal mines produced less fuel. Steel factories operated far below capacity. Many urban residents left cities altogether, returning to rural villages where food was slightly easier to obtain. One of the most serious challenges to Bolshevik authority came in early 1921 at the naval base of Kronstadt, near Petrograd. Sailors there, who had once been strong supporters of the revolution, demanded reforms. They called for greater political freedom and relief from economic hardship. The government viewed this as a dangerous rebellion. Red Army forces attacked the base across frozen waters, eventually defeating the uprising. The suppression of Kronstadt signaled that the Bolshevik leadership would not tolerate open dissent, even from former allies. The scale of suffering during these years was immense. A severe famine struck parts of Russia in 1921 and 1922. Crops had failed in several regions, and years of war had disrupted agriculture. Millions faced starvation. International relief organizations eventually provided some assistance, but the damage was profound. Entire communities struggled to recover. The famine became one of the darkest chapters of the post-war period. Faced with economic collapse and widespread unrest, Lenin and other Bolshevik leaders recognized that change was necessary. In 1921, they introduced a new economic policy. This policy allowed limited private trade and small-scale private businesses. Peasants were permitted to sell surplus grain after paying a fixed tax. The aim was to revive the economy without abandoning the long-term goal of building a socialist state. This shift marked an important turning point. It demonstrated that even revolutionary governments sometimes had to adapt to reality. Gradually, markets reopened, small businesses returned, and agricultural production began to improve. Although the scars of war remained, signs of recovery appeared in towns and villages. Meanwhile, political consolidation continued. The Bolsheviks, now calling themselves the Communist Party, strengthened their control over government institutions. Opposition parties were banned. The secret police expanded their authority. Political power became increasingly centralized. The experience of civil war had convinced many leaders that strict control was necessary to prevent renewed chaos. In December 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was formally established. Russia, along with Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian Federation, joined together in a new political structure. This marked the official birth of what would later become one of the most powerful states in the 20th century. The legacy of the Russian Civil War was complex and lasting. It had reshaped borders, destroyed the old aristocratic order, and created a new socialist government. It had also hardened attitudes, normalized political repression, and deepened divisions within society. Entire generations grew up shaped by stories of revolution, sacrifice, and struggle. For ordinary people, the memory of the Civil War remained vivid. Families remembered relatives who never returned for battle. Villages remembered the arrival of competing armies. Cities remembered hunger and fear. At the same time, some remembered hope, believing they had witnessed the birth of a new social order that promised equality and justice. The Russian Civil War was not a single, simple conflict. It was a vast and complicated struggle that combined ideology, military campaigns, foreign intervention, social upheaval, and economic collapse. It determined the political future of a nation that stretched across continents. It influenced global politics for decades, as other countries watched the rise of a socialist state born from revolution and civil war. By the early 1920s, the guns had largely fallen silent, but the transformation of Russia was only beginning. A new government stood in place of the old empire, carrying forward the lessons and scars of years of relentless conflict. As the violence of the Russian Civil War slowly faded in the early 1920s, the land that had once been the Russian Empire stood transformed beyond recognition. The old world of tsars, nobles, imperial officers, and vast estates had disappeared. In its place stood a new state built on revolutionary ideals, hardened by years of relentless conflict and shaped by extraordinary human suffering. The Bolsheviks had emerged victorious, but their victory came at an immense cost. Estimates of the dead vary, but millions perished between 1918 and 1921. Some died in battle. Many more died from famine, disease, exposure, and displacement. Entire towns had lost large portions of their populations. Railways lay damaged. Bridges were destroyed. Farms had been abandoned or stripped of livestock. Industry, which had already been weakened by World War I, was operating at only a fraction of its former strength. The war left deep emotional and psychological scars. Families were divided by ideology. Brothers sometimes fought on opposite sides. Suspicion became a common part of life, as political loyalty could mean survival or imprisonment. The years of terror, executions, and reprisals had normalized violence as a tool of political control. This atmosphere would influence the character of the new Soviet state in the years to come. Yet alongside destruction, there was also determination to rebuild. The new economic policy, introduced in 1921, began to stabilize the economy. Markets cautiously reopened. Small shops reappeared in cities. Peasants were allowed to sell surplus crops after meeting state quotas. Slowly, agricultural production improved. Urban life began to recover. Factories restarted production, though often with outdated equipment and limited resources. Politically, the Communist Party tightened its hold over power. Other parties were banned, and political debate outside the party became increasingly dangerous. The leadership believed that unity was essential to prevent another civil war. Party membership grew, and a new generation of officials emerged, many of whom had been shaped by the hardships of war. Loyalty, discipline, and ideological commitment were valued above all. The creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in December 1922 formalized the new political order. It brought together multiple republics under a centralized federal system. Although the structure suggested cooperation among republics, real power remained concentrated in the leadership in Moscow. The Civil War had convinced many leaders that only strong central authority could hold such a vast territory together. Internationally, the new Soviet state was viewed with suspicion. Many foreign governments had supported the White forces during the war. Now they faced a revolutionary government that openly promoted socialist ideas. Diplomatic recognition came slowly. Trade relations were cautious. Yet despite isolation, the Soviet government survived and gradually began to establish its presence on the world stage. For ordinary people, daily life after the war was a mixture of hardship and cautious hope. Cities were quieter than during the years of fighting. Soldiers returned home, some carrying injuries or memories they would never forget. Peasants returned to their fields. Children who had grown up amid chaos began attending newly organized schools. Education and literacy campaigns expanded as the government aimed to reshape society through knowledge and ideology. The Civil War had also changed the nature of the military. The Red Army, forged in desperate circumstances, became a permanent institution of the new state. Its officers carried with them the lessons of mobile warfare, strict discipline, and centralized command. These lessons would influence military planning for decades. Culturally, the war inspired literature, songs, and art that reflected both suffering and revolutionary pride. Writers described frozen battlefields, crowded trains, starving villages, and the determination of soldiers who believed they were building a new future. These cultural memories helped shape the identity of the Soviet Union, presenting the Civil War as a foundational struggle that secured the revolution. But beneath official narratives of heroism lay the quiet stories of grief. Families remembered loved ones lost to execution or famine. Villages remembered requisition squads and passing armies. The cost of victory was deeply personal for millions. The Russian Civil War was more than a fight for political power. It was a struggle over the very structure of society. It determined whether Russia would return to monarchy, become a democratic republic, or transform into a socialist state. The outcome reshaped not only Russia, but also global politics. The existence of a powerful socialist government influenced political movements across Europe, Asia, and beyond throughout the 20th century. By the mid-1920s, stability had begun to take root, though it was fragile. The guns were silent, but the memories remained. The nation that emerged from the conflict was fundamentally different from the empire that had collapsed in 1917. It was more centralized, more ideological, and more controlled. The Russian Civil War stands as one of the most complex and transformative conflicts of the modern era. It involved vast territories, multiple armies, foreign interventions, ideological struggles, and profound human suffering. It destroyed an ancient imperial system and laid the foundation for a new superpower. When the fighting finally ended, what remained was not simply a battlefield reclaimed by silence, but a society reshaped by revolution and endurance. From the frozen plains of Siberia to the crowded streets of Moscow and Petrograd, the echoes of civil war lingered in memory, in politics, and in the structure of the state itself. And from that difficult and turbulent beginning, the Soviet Union would rise, carrying forward both the aspirations and the heavy burdens left behind by years of relentless conflict.